Hello everybody and welcome back to Creation Myths. Today we're going to have the first part in a new series called Creation Tricks. Like Creation Myths, this will be an ongoing series where we'll look at claims that creationists make that don't stand up to scrutiny. In this specific series, we're going to look at tricks creationists use in lieu of having good evidence to support their position. The first creationist trick we're going to look at is misrepresenting their sources. This trick is used because of a problem for creationists. The problem is that creationists don't publish peer-reviewed literature. The scientific community, which overwhelmingly supports evolution and evolutionary theory, has a library of knowledge in peer-reviewed literature, experiments upon experiments showing support for this or that aspect of evolutionary theory. Creationists don't have that. Creationists do have journals, but they're not peer-reviewed, and the scientific community rightly does not take them seriously. So for example, you've got the Journal of Creation, you've got Answers Research Journal from Answers in Genesis, and my personal favorite is Biocomplexity, the in-house journal from Discovery Institute. This is a really interesting one because Discovery Institute presents itself as a scientific organization, and they kind of like wink and nudge towards the fact that organizations like Answers in Genesis and Creation Ministries International are not scientific organizations, even though they also pretend to be sometimes. But just the same, DI has their own in-house journal, and if you read the description, they actually say right there in black and white that the point of this journal is to promote intelligent design, which is not the kind of thing a traditional journal does, and if they were doing real science, they wouldn't need their own in-house journal to promote their own point of view anyway. So that kind of gives up the game. But the journals are kind of tangential to this story. I am going to talk about them more at some point in the future. But what I want to talk about here is the solution to the problem of not having literature of your own or literature that supports your point of view. The solution that many creationists use is to misrepresent actual scientific literature. Now, sometimes this is like painfully obvious when they do this. One well-known example that you may or may not have heard of is how a paper on calibrating equipment to do radiocarbon dating has been misused by young Earth creationists to claim that nothing is older than the tens of thousands of years range, like 40 to 50,000 years. If you haven't heard of that, don't worry about it. It's a long story. It doesn't matter for right now, but it's just egregious and obvious. However, other cases are sometimes quite subtle, and we're going to look at a very subtle example today of how creationists misrepresent the sources they use in order to promote their own viewpoint. So the example we're going to look at today comes from Dr. Georgia Purdom, who is a creationist geneticist. This is from a presentation at Creation College 3, an event that occurred in 2009, and I'll link to this video. The full thing is on YouTube. I'll link to it in the description. This presentation was called Genetics, Evolution, and Creation, Most Asked Questions. And there's a lot of topics covered in this video, but the thing that I'm going to point out occurs relatively early. I think it was like in the 15-ish minute mark, but I don't recall exactly off the top of my head. So the misrepresentation here is that Purdom claims a 2004 paper by Dan Grauer and William Martin shows how divergence estimates are not reliable. Basically, divergence estimates are using phylogenetic data like genome data and comparing genes to make phylogenetic trees, and then calculating at what point in the past two lineages split from each other. That's called a divergence estimate. You're estimating the time, if you go backwards, to that divergence event. Grauer and Martin in 2004 argued that a lot of people doing these types of estimates were being too precise in their numbers, and they conclude their paper by saying, despite their allure, we must sadly conclude that all divergence estimates discussed here are without merit. Our advice to the reader is this: whenever you see a time estimate in the evolutionary literature, demand uncertainty. Purdom takes this quote and presents it along the lines of, look, even the biologists are saying you can't trust any of these numbers. So you know what? The actual data, when you do it correctly, shows that everything is related very closely, if it's related at all, therefore young Earth. Right? That's how Purdom is using this paper. Now let's look at the actual quote. Despite their allure, we must sadly conclude that all divergence estimates discussed here are without merit. Our advice to the reader is this: Whenever you see a time estimate in the evolutionary literature, demand uncertainty. That sounds the same, doesn't it? You see the difference? It's subtle. I told you it was going to be subtle. There's the difference. The references. Purdom removed the references from that quote, and in doing so, changed the whole meaning. Grauer and Martin were not saying this entire technique is not trustworthy. They were saying, in the specific cases we're talking about here, the authors were too precise in their estimates. They had a conclusion that was more certain than the data they used should have permitted. That's what Grauer and Martin were actually saying, not what Purdom presented. The authors were not saying the technique is invalid. They're saying these specific instances were poorly done. But Purdom takes this out of context to say, here are the biologists saying that this technique is not trustworthy. And that's a very subtle example, not changing any words, not omitting any words, just omitting the references. It's a very subtle example of where a creationist can take something in the literature and twist the meaning around to present it as supporting their case. To summarize, creationists do not have peer-reviewed literature to support their own case for creation and specifically for a young Earth. They often misrepresent publications in the peer-reviewed literature to present them as though they support their case, even though they do not. And one example of this is Dr. Georgia Purdom claiming that Grauer and Martin 2004 shows that divergence estimates are invalid. The solution to this problem? Always check creationist sources. Always. Even when it seems like the claim is mundane and you could just say, yeah, sure, whatever, that's fine. Always check creationist sources. So that is our first creation trick, misrepresenting sources. If you like this kind of thing, please subscribe. There's going to be more like this down the road. So thank you for watching. I will see you soon. Don't get fooled.